Bonjour, merci d'être ici ce matin pour une conférence de presse au sujet de le racisme dans le cœur de la GRC. La semaine dernière, j'ai dit à ce place exactement le même, que c'est vrai que la GRC est une institution raciste. I want to stop and back up and make sure it's very, very clear that Greens understand that the vast majority of RCMP officers are highly professional, very dedicated, and risk their lives for us. So this is not to say by any stretch that we think that RCMP officers in general are racist. We're speaking of the institution, the organization, its corporate culture. And I wanted to provide further evidence of the fact that this isn't one or two officers who don't understand the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's the organization as a corporation, as an institution. And that's made very clear by the access to information details of the bidding process to build the RCMP Occupational Communication Center for Nova Scotia. This bidding process took place a few years ago, and the facts behind it came to light through access to information earlier this spring. Attached to this press release, you will find a letter to Minister Bill Blair and Minister Carolyn Bennett and Minister Mark Miller from the Chief of Millbrook First Nation, Chief Robert Glode. Millbrook First Nation I know well. It's Nova Scotia. It's part of the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy territory. It's Mi'kmaq. And it's a very entrepreneurial First Nation. It's got a lot of business operations going on. It's more than competent and capable to mount its own business case for why it should have a fair chance at building and hosting the RCMP Communication Center in Nova Scotia. And it's extraordinary to me that under potential for expansion, the Millbrook proposal got a 0 score. The RCMP scored the various competing bids, options 1 to 6. It was scoring itself because option 4 was the RCMP's own option, running it out of their own divisional headquarters. And they rigged the process. There's no question they rigged the process. They gave themselves real property costing at the RCMP headquarters, 0 cost. And Millbrook, they invented, because the Millbrook First Nation has no idea where this number came from, $1.6 million. Now, the former member of Parliament for this area deserves all the credit for the homework on this that he has been handing me and others for weeks now. But Bill Casey, former member for the area, has been incensed by this, by the degree of interference by RCMP corporate to undermine a fair chance for a First Nation to bid. And as Chief Glode says, and I can't do better than to quote Chief Glode on this in the letter that's attached to our press release, that the government claims that they fully support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and claims to want to follow the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Murdered and Missing Women Report. And then Chief Glode calls and quotes from sections of each of those and makes it clear that Millbrook is not asking for special measures such as these documents would suggest would be required for justice for Indigenous people. I'll quote Chief Glode, "We are not asking for special measures. We just want a level playing field and a fair chance to compete for this economic opportunity." The first competition was not a level playing field. Now that episode, the ongoing question, which has, as far as we know, not been responded to by the ministers, and certainly Bill Casey, as recently as yesterday, was on a Halifax radio station saying, "Let me debate the RCMP. Let me at them," basically Bill Casey is saying, because he has looked at all the details of these competing proposals. And it's clear the RCMP rigged the competition to disadvantage a First Nation. Now, if that isn't a definition of institutional racism, I don't know what is. And by the way, of course, there were other bidders. One should note that they were also disadvantaged by the way the RCMP ran the competition. Since I've been leader of the Green Party of Canada, and I am no longer leader, I'm past leader and parliamentary leader, but in the years when I played a role politically, the numbers of times we have called for an investigation, a full inquiry into RCMP action. I suppose that the press release lists some of them. I should mention that it wasn't, pardon me, it wasn't directly a call for an investigation into the RCMP, but we did also call for a public investigation of the shootings that took place on Parliament Hill, October 22nd, 2014. There was no investigation of that incident at all, no public investigation, no findings. That certainly would have touched on RCMP performance, but we did call for a formal investigation into RCMP interference in the 2006 election. We called for a full investigation into the way the RCMP, in militarized garb with attack dogs, arrested peaceful protesters in Elsipogtog, New Brunswick, in the protests against fracking in 2013. We have called for investigation of sexism within the RCMP, and I've worked with wonderful women within the RCMP who have told me the horror stories of how they've been treated on the job. We've called for an investigation about what the RCMP knew about the scandal of money laundering in BC casinos. Bear in mind that money laundering is linked to the start of the fentanyl poisonings, the opioid crisis, the skewing of real estate in on our mainland and in Vancouver area. This is a devastating impact on the lives of British Columbians that money laundering went through the casino. Primary culpability is with the previous government of Christy Clark. But what did the RCMP know, and why did they not blow the whistle? We've called for a public inquiry into that. We called for a public inquiry into the violent arrests of Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs last winter, and we called recently for an inquiry into the extent to which RCMP officers and throughout the institution have links to white supremacists or other racist organizations. That call, by the way, includes other police forces other than the RCMP, bearing in mind, of course, that Chantal Moore was killed by Edmundston, New Brunswick police and not the RCMP. But we now look at how did the RCMP handle the April 2020, mass murders in Nova Scotia. And there must be an inquiry immediately into the killing of Rodney Levy by New Brunswick RCMP, another Mi'kmaq man, father of 3. We need to put the RCMP under a microscope. We need an inquiry that fully explores how the RCMP conducts itself. It's really hard to have confidence in the ability of this organization to reform itself on any number of these various incidents. What's very clear is that the institution is unaccountable, and the story of the Millbrook First Nation and the skewing of the bidding process proves that they know they're unaccountable. They know they're untouchable. This was penny-ante, scummy activity that they could only have done if they figure, no one ever touches us. C'est clair que maintenant, l'ensemble des expériences récentes n'inspire pas confiance. L'image donnée est celle d'une organisation qui ne rend pas de compte, jamais, et qui nous cache des choses, toujours. A secretive, unaccountable organization is not the culture you want in your state police. The individual RCMP officers deserve better. They deserve a culture of accountability. Women in the RCMP need to know that their tormentors and bullies do not get promoted, leaving them with the scar tissue and damage, leaving them with post-traumatic stress disorder. The family of Colton Bushy is still waiting. They had a finding from an internal investigation. It's been in the hands of the RCMP since January of this year about how the RCMP treated Colton Bushy's mother and family when delivering the news that their son had been murdered. These things scream out for justice, a full inquiry, and nothing less. Thank you.
We'll now take questions, starting with questions on the phone. A quick reminder, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions, commençant par les questions téléphone. Un petit rappel, une question suivie par journaliste. Operator, do we have the first question, please?
Thank you. Merci. The first question, la première question is from Jim Bronskill, the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Good morning. You've clearly called for an inquiry into the RCMP. Is that the extent of what you'd like to see at this point, or are there concrete changes that can be made in the short term that would remedy the things you spelled out today?
Thank you, Jim Bronskill. I failed to mention one very concrete thing that I will be taking up later today as we debate supplementary estimates, and that's the question of a further $18 million on top of, the budget in round numbers for the RCMP this year will be $3.7 billion. We certainly, as Greens, do not question at all the additional several hundred million to ensure that officers receive compensation for injuries on the job. But there's an unexplained $18 million in supplementary estimates, and we think it would be a show of good faith for the RCMP to withdraw this request. We don't believe that we should be, as a Parliament, without any further information than what's in supplementary estimates, and I can read it to you. What it says is 18 million funding to strengthen RCMP policing operations. I don't know if that means buying tanks. It doesn't mean buying more tear gas. Don't know what that means. I don't want to see that $18 million spent. In the short term and immediately, the RCMP as an institution needs to review, and I think this could be done in an inquiry, but they need to review, and I'd put people on it the way we vet candidates. I'd go, let's go through the social media history of everyone. Let's see if they ever posted something racist about Indigenous people or Black Canadians. Let's check this out, because anybody serving in the RCMP should not harbor racist views. And I think that I'd be very surprised if we didn't find quite a lot of unfortunate social media history that would suggest links to white supremacist organizations. I think that needs to be done immediately. But immediately, I think the RCMP need to respond to the Colton Bushy family as a result of the civilian inquiry that already tendered its findings earlier this year. The ball is now in the RCMP court. There are many things they could do immediately to help inspire confidence. But this litany of not violence against individuals, killing individuals, unaccountability, interfering in our election, unaccountability, down the line. The RCMP as an institution must become accountable. And I don't think small tweaks around the edges will make that happen.
Follow-up?
There's, as you know, a lot of talk about defunding police or adjusting the funding that goes to police. So that's sort of part A. What do you think of that in the context of the RCMP? I guess part B to that would be, the RCMP does a lot. It does everything from frontline policing in Saskatchewan and other places to, as you say, supposed to be tackling, espionage and money laundering. Is that something to be looked at as well, the broad scope of what the RCMP does?
Thank you for the question. I think defunding is an unfortunate slogan because certainly the currently before Toronto City Council is a proposal to cut by 10% the Toronto City Police Force budget. That's not RCMP, but that's very much to your question. The movement for defunding is picking up steam in direct response to anti-Black racism, killing of Indigenous people. I think it needs to be examined. I don't want to see us pass $18 million more without knowing what it's for. If it was for instance, training RCMP officers in how to de-escalate a situation, I'd support that. But what they're looking at in the Toronto City Council right now is if they took 10% of the Toronto City Police budget, that would be $100 million. Could that be put to better mental health support programs, more social programs? I think if we think about the RCMP and the equipment that we see and city police forces. We know that over the last number of years, probably since 9/11, we could trace an increase in budgets for policing to look more militarized, constantly more militarized, with outfits that used to look like, it's Darth Vader and Stormtrooper world. If we think of that as the PPE for police and contrast it with the PPE for our frontline healthcare workers, we can realize that something's out of whack. And it seems that police budgets have ballooned for things like armored vehicles that look like tanks, and for tear gas, and for flashbangs, and for equipment to take on riots. And that is deployed far too often into peaceful protests. So I'd like to just examine the PPE and say, let's make sure that our frontline healthcare workers, that's the focus. Make sure they have what they need, and stop equipping our police forces, whether municipal or RCMP, as though they're going to war on their own citizens.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Yasmine Mehdi, Radio-Canada. Please go ahead, your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Bonjour, Madame May. Je voudrais vous entendre sur la prolongation de la PCU qui a été annoncée hier et puis sur le vote aujourd'hui sur les crédits budgétaires. Est-ce que vous allez appuyer le gouvernement Trudeau?
Oui, sur la question de la grande majorité des dépenses dont les estimats aujourd'hui sont tellement importants. Par exemple, il y a les fonds pour justice pour les jeunes autochtones, les familles qui a fait le nuire avec le 60s scoop. That money is in here. Aussi, c'est les fonds pour les dépenses à cause de les décisions pour égalité pour les enfants autochtones en manière d'éducation et de bonne santé. Il y a les choses ici très, très importantes et je vais voter oui, mais aussi en même temps, je vais faire les efforts d'éliminer les fonds de 18 millions pour le GRC pour les choses qui ne sont pas expliquées pas du tout.
Autre dossier, maintenant, le vote pour le Conseil de sécurité des Nations unies qui a lieu aujourd'hui. Est-ce que vous pensez que le Canada mérite de gagner le siège?
C'est une question difficile pour moi parce que je suis une fière Canadienne et pour moi, c'est un rêve d'avoir notre siège une autre fois sur le Conseil sécuritaire. C'est un rôle important. La question de notre mérite et les questions de Norvège et Irlande, je pense que nous n'avons pas fait les choses sur la question de l'urgence climatique pour gagner ce siège. Nous n'avons pas fait les choses pour l'élimination de pauvreté partout au monde. J'apporte mon petit signe de les 17 cibles des buts de développement durable des Nations unies, toujours, parce que je pense à notre engagement pour l'élimination de pauvreté. Mais nous sommes presque le seul pays industrialisé qui donne les fonds vers les pays en développement, qui actuellement n'est pas engagé pour la cible de 0,7% de notre GNI pour la cause du développement. Alors, nous avons les faiblesses dans notre bilan. Quand même, j'espère que nous voyons gagner le siège. Mais je ne suis pas certain. Nous pouvons faire plus, c'est clair. Oh, yes. I, as a proud Canadian, would love to see us win the seat at the Security Council. So I am conflicted because I know that Norway and Ireland have done far more, for instance, in eliminating poverty in terms of overseas development assistance. It was a Canadian, after all, Lester B. Pearson, as our former Prime Minister, who picked that target, that wealthy countries should ensure that 0.7% of their gross national product was dedicated to overseas development assistance to eliminate poverty. We know that we could have done far more to earn that seat, had we established climate targets that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. We still have the same climate target that we had more than 5 years ago when Stephen Harper put it there. It doesn't help us win the seat that we've done less than Ireland and less than Norway on climate. And I wear my Sustainable Development Goals pin, all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Canada has committed to achieving them by 2030. If our record was better, I think we'd have a better chance of winning that seat on the Security Council. But I can't help myself. I'm rooting for us to win the seat, but I don't know if we've earned it.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Brett Forrester, National News. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Hello, Ms. May. Brett here from APTN. My question is, why push for a public inquiry that would probably take, a long time and a lot of money when we already have numerous public inquiries and reports that deal with policing and Indigenous people, from the Neil Stonechild report to the Ipperwash report right up to the MMIWG report? Why push for a new inquiry rather than just push for the implementation of some of those recommendations?
It's an excellent question, Brett. Those reports, I don't think were sufficiently comprehensive. We've looked at individual incidents. We've looked at events in isolation. I think the culture of the RCMP needs to be put under a microscope. The RCMP clearly sees itself as unaccountable. How else could it think it would get away with rigging a process for an RCMP communications center? I mean, this is transparent rigging of a process. I mean, the inquiry needs to look at more than sexism within the RCMP, racism within the RCMP, incompetence within the RCMP. It needs to look at a culture that sees itself as unaccountable. And I think we need to put on the table, are we getting good value for money from the RCMP? Does the province of British Columbia get good value for money in having the RCMP do policing through most of BC? I mean, there are other incidents and they pile up. The killing of Ian Bush. Yes, he wasn't an Indigenous kid. He was a white kid killed in police custody in very suspicious circumstances. These incidents weigh on us, and I think more is needed. I think the RCMP needs to feel an existential threat. The Canadians are ready to wonder if it's worth keeping. So that's different than saying, yes, in Ipperwash we saw racism. Yes, we've seen racism. Yes, we've seen untoward violence, unjustified violence. I mean, the fact that it was just Friday, it's only on Friday that Rodney Levy was killed in New Brunswick. He happens to be someone that my colleague Jenica Atwin, Green Party MP, she knows Rodney Levy. These are human beings being killed. I mean, obviously it wasn't the RCMP that killed Chantal Moore. I'm very close friends with a lot of people who are close friends of Chantal Moore's family. This is not acceptable, this degree of racism. If something other than inquiry would do it, c'est possible. Pour moi, une enquête plus compréhensive que les autres. Il y a enquête après enquête qui fait rien. On doit avoir une enquête fondamentale pour étudier la culture des GRC, pour chercher les raisons pour lesquelles c'est une organisation qui ne rend pas de compte. Jamais. I think the RCMP thinks it is the law and above the law. That needs to be taken on board more fundamentally than body cams or sensitivity training. One or two tweaking measures around the margins won't make the difference. So I agree with you, Brett. There are more than enough studies, but they take on different aspects of the culture of the RCMP. And I think we need to look right at squarely, particularly in senior management, what kind of organization thinks they can continue to ignore these studies, continue to ignore calls for justice, continue to ignore, for instance, the Police Complaints Commission when it investigated the RCMP interference in the 2006 election. Former Police Chief Zach Ardelli, RCMP Commissioner Zach Ardelli, changed the course of our electoral politics took an election away from one party and gave it to the other. And he was allowed to say, no, I'm too busy to show up to answer your questions. You can't summons me. There's a culture here that's bigger than any one incident or any one report.
Follow up?
Yes, thank you. As a follow-up, I'd just like to ask what police reform looks like, or in your opinion, when it comes to Indigenous communities, because many policing in Indigenous communities is already underfunded. So the call to defund the police really doesn't work when, Indigenous police forces, First Nations police forces are already fighting for equitable funding. So I'm wondering what you think police reform looks like when it comes to First Nations policing and Indigenous policing.
I think it's an excellent question, but it's clear that one first step would be that any officer policing Indigenous communities needs the permission of Indigenous communities to do so. The Indigenous nations should have the ability and the right to interview and vet the police who are going to be on their territory to ensure that the people who are there are lifesavers, not people who are untrained and likely to pull out a gun when talking calmly might do better. I think that the sovereignty issues on Indigenous territories is a good starting point. And I'm not going to be the one who can say what kind of rules should exist for Indigenous communities and Indigenous policing, because that really is a question for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to determine. But I don't think the policing decisions should be made outside of questions of sovereignty.
We'll now finish with questions in the room. I'll ask the reporter to make their way to the standing microphone right there. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions dans la salle. Je demande aux journalistes de se rendre au micro sur pied. Merci.
Ian Wood, CTV News. Ms. May, Commissioner Lucky, I think we've all read through the comments that she made about having not having systemic racism in the RCMP, and then backtracking on that, along with some of her deputy commissioners. Do you still have confidence in Commissioner Lucky and the top ranks of the RCMP to carry out this sort of inquiry or be part of it?
Well, I definitely understand why Senator Lillian Dick said what she said. But when I look at the institution, I wonder, and when it's personalized to the commissioner and say, okay, the commissioner should resign or be fired, will the next commissioner be different? That's the question for me. It's a fundamental question that goes beyond any one person. It's an organizational cultural problem, and it's been of long duration. So I think really I can't have confidence in any part of the RCMP at this point. But I certainly would love to see Superintendent Lucky take this on board and say, she has said, I was wrong, there is systemic racism. If she starts saying, right, we have this overdue report to Colton Bushy's family, let's get going with that. We have this overdue calls for action from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, which of course found that one of the reasons vulnerable women were killed was that they were scared to go to the RCMP because they'd experienced violence at the hands of different RCMP officers over their lifetime or through their family members. This is fundamental, and I don't want to pin it on any one person because I think it's cultural.
Next question.
Yeah, Todd from APTN. I just want to revisit how you're supporting Canada being voted into the Security Council today. But is this a good time, considering what's been going on, and you've been talking about systemic racism during your press conference all morning? Is this a good time for Canada to be being represented internationally when our values good enough? Have we done well enough to be on that Security Council?
Our treatment, Canada's colonial past and current treatment of Indigenous peoples is certainly a demerit when anyone looks at voting for Canada on Security Council. Well, I recognize that, but these seats come up very rarely, and one would hope, and I would certainly hope, that the additional spotlight on Canada as a Security Council member would increase the calls for justice, for the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and full implementation of the recommendations from the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the calls for action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But we shall see what the international community makes of our bid later today.
Morning, Ms. May. Ashley Burke, CBC News. Can you expand on if it's time to rethink the RCMP's funding and if it's time to get out of contract policing and why?
This is a question that has weighed on our minds as Greens for quite a while. We in looking at it as British Columbians, a lot of people have raised this question because what happens with the RCMP contract is it's a cash cow for the RCMP, but quite often they move young officers in and out of remote and smaller communities rather rapidly. They don't put down roots. They don't know the community. It's not as good a plan as having people who've lived in that community, who are your local police, who know people. Now, I have to say the local RCMP in my community in southern Vancouver Island, there's a group of people who are just fantastic, and quite a few of them have those roots and have stayed longer. But the RCMP model is to move people around, and I think that undercuts and undermines the kind of community service, community awareness that you need for good policing. And I think a lot of British Columbians are wondering if we're getting good value for money.
And how comfortable are you with the lack of scrutiny given to these spending estimates prior to today's vote? And as well, last week's bill continues to languish. How concerned are you, if at all, that the measures it contains won't proceed as the House wraps up for summer today?
Well, we'll be back July 8th, which is not the case when we usually wrap at the end of June. I have to say, number one, when I was first elected in June of 2011 and took my seat, in the time it took me to walk from the Senate, having just heard the speech from the throne, to get back to the House to take my seat in the House, Harper administration had pushed through $6 billion in supplementary estimates deemed to have been studied, deemed to have been read, done, and no study at all. So I think 4 hours of study is inadequate, but it's not uncommon. I also think we need to bite the bullet on remote voting. It's the one piece that's missing from allowing us to function as a full parliament. We need to get going on legislation that sits languishing, that's been tabled, and legislation we need that we haven't seen yet, like the Climate Accountability Act that was promised and the Just Transition Act that was promised. If we voted remotely, as only in pandemic, I'm not making a case that Parliament shouldn't sit, we shouldn't vote in our normal way when we're not in pandemic. But I argue we should have two sets of standing rules, one for normal times, one for extraordinary cases like a pandemic, and we need to be able to vote remotely because we've already proved we can study bills remotely. What we can't do is vote remotely, and we need to fix that.
That's all the time we have. This concludes the press conference. Merci beaucoup.
Merci
C'est ce qui met
beaucoup.
fin à la conférence de presse.
Meg Witch, merci. Thank you, everyone.